And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. This episode of Podcast on the Brink is brought to you by Crane Credit Union. Get a $150 deposit into your new Crane Credit Union checking account when you get e-statements, have direct deposit, and use your debit card. Plus, there's no monthly service charges and no minimum balance to open your account. Stop in at any of Crane Credit Union's 14 locations or visit their website at cranecu.org for more information. That's cranecu.org. Crane Credit Union is federally insured by NCUA. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I welcome Mike DeCourcy back to the show. Mike covers college basketball for the Sporting News and is a studio analyst for the Big Ten Network. We discuss James Blackmon Jr.'s up-and-down career at Indiana, whether he made the right decision by leaving school, what it will take for Thomas Bryant to succeed at the next level, what Juwan Morgan needs to do to rebound from a disappointing sophomore season, why Josh Newkirk may be a particular beneficiary of Archie Miller's coaching style, as well as a look around the Big Ten and how the Hoosiers should factor in Archie Miller's first season. All of that and more coming up on this edition of Podcast on the Brink. Hey, real quick, I want to tell you about our sponsor, SeatGeek. As you know, the NBA playoffs are in full swing, and SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every game. With SeatGeek's seamless mobile experience, you can buy and sell tickets in just 2 taps. SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone, and it's by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets. I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I actually used SeatGeek earlier this season to buy tickets to a couple Mavericks games so that I could watch Yogi play, and you can use it, and it'll be easy and convenient for you as well. SeatGeek saves you time and saves you money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find amazing deals, and it doesn't end with sports. SeatGeek also has plenty of concert, comedy, and theater tickets available too. So here's what you need to do. Because the best part is, listeners of Podcast on the Brink actually get $20 off of their first SeatGeek purchase. So download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, today. That's promo code BRINK for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. All right, let's proceed with this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. We're joined on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink by the great Mike DeCourcy from the Sporting News and the Big Ten Network. He's at TSN Mike on Twitter. Mike, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink.
Gentlemen, how are you?
Very well, very well. So I want to start out by asking you about James Blackmon Jr. because James announced, obviously, that he's leaving Indiana, and he was clearly one of the most talented scorers in the history of IU, but also a guy who had his fair share of detractors because of his defensive liabilities. And I've always found your analysis of James interesting because you've seemed more willing than most to focus on what he does well rather than what he doesn't. And so as we kind of reflect now on James's 3 years in Bloomington, do you believe he was generally underrated, overrated, or properly rated by fans in the media for what he was as a player over 3 years?
Well, I would probably have to say properly rated too, because I think his ability as a scorer was probably less appreciated than it might have been, because the defensive issues never really went away. And I mean, the two seasons in which he played the most both resulted in fairly disappointing finishes. One missing the tournament altogether, and the other squeezing in as a 10 seed and losing in the first round, albeit in a competitive fashion. And then, of course, in between, the year he missed most of because of his injury, they went out and won the conference championship in his absence. And so I think that from that standpoint, people will point to that and say, they did better without him than with him, and you can't dispute the math of that, the reality of that. It is what it is, as they say, and not my favorite cliche, but you can't argue with that result. I do think that he was a phenomenal scorer, and his ability as a scorer won some big games for them. The Kansas game in Hawaii being the most obvious example of that. And this particular team, when he became injured, certainly was diminished by his absence. When he got hurt late in the year, they certainly missed him when he was gone. Yeah, the thing that always disappointed me about James is that there's no reason he's a poor defender. I didn't see great progression on that end of the floor over the course of his career, and I always believed that although not everybody's going to be Gary Payton, with his length and athletic ability and size and hands, he should have been able to work up to the point where he wasn't looked at as a liability. And I don't think he may have gotten to the point where he wasn't a total liability, but he never became someone that wasn't looked at as a defender who could be better.
And it's interesting as you look toward next year's team. Archie Miller obviously wants to start developing a new defensive identity for Indiana, but you look up and down the roster, and it's a roster devoid of the individual scoring ability that a guy like James has. So how big of a loss do you think he is for next year's Hoosiers in particular?
Oh, it's a loss. There's no question. Because if you were getting back an 18-point scorer and a guy who's capable really, if he had come back, he was capable of averaging the 20s. So that's a significant loss. Don't kid yourself. To be able to have that as you rebuild or retool or set the foundation for your program, however you want to describe that, to be able to have that would be a great luxury. But his teams, Arch's teams at Dayton, won a lot of basketball games without ever having that player. I mean, they had very good players at Dayton, guys, Scoochie Smith being the name everybody remembers, partly because he was a terrific player and partly because his name was Scoochie. But Scoochie never averaged big numbers in either points or assists. So he's shown he can build an identity without that elite scorer. And I think eventually they're going to want to have guys who can do that, who can go out and get you 20, 25. And I think De'Ron Davis, if he is able to earn starters minutes, and I suspect he will, but we're starting from square one here. If he's able to earn starters minutes, I don't see any reason why he can't be a 16-point-a-game scorer for this team. And that's a great place to start, presuming that they play as well defensively as Arch will want to.
Mike, last thing on Blackmon Jr., there's been some fans, obviously, and this happens, I think, everywhere, that have criticized James for his decision to leave, saying that he's not going to make the NBA. And I've kind of said, I think for him it was probably the best decision because, there's been some debate as to whether or not he actually has his degree. I know he's close at this point, but in terms of his future as a professional, if he were to come back next year, I don't think he's necessarily going to be one of those guys like a Buddy Hield or a Denzel Valentine that breaks out and has a huge senior season resulting in a first round draft pick. But if he does come back and gets hurt, then it could totally end his aspirations to play professionally. Just overall, what do you think of his decision to leave early, despite the fact that he's probably not going to be drafted?
I think that you're 100% right in your analysis, Alex. If you are a player who has the ability to get into the first round, and you choose to go into the draft regardless before that, if you are a Denzel Valentine who has real ability, or Buddy Hield who has real ability to be drafted that high, and you choose to go, the heck with it, I'm just going to go. It's a mistake because you only get to enter through the front door one time. And if you choose to go through the side or the back door, you're costing yourself money. And so I think that what Buddy did and what Denzel did was really smart. But it is somewhat courageous because you do have to have an injury-free season. and you do have to have a great season in that regard. The idea, this notion that people propagate, and I've heard coaches do it, and it makes me crazy, is the idea that you get exposed the longer you play. That's nonsense. It's garbage. You don't get exposed if you get better. I mean, Buddy Hield became a better player, a dramatically better player as a senior than he'd been in the previous 3 years of his career. He didn't get exposed. He got exposed as a great talent, and he got to be the 7th player taken in the draft. So you don't get exposed. I mean, we already know that James Blackmon's not, we just discussed it for several minutes, he's not a proficient defensive player. I mean, maybe if he'd have come back, he could have improved in that regard and improved his standing with professional scouts, and maybe gotten himself into the first round. But in his belief and in his current circumstance, we don't have any reason to believe that improvement is out there. And so, I look at his decision. If he wants to leave, then that's the right decision. If he wanted to stay and weren't wanted by his new coaches, I know that's not true, but if that were the case, then it would be the right decision to leave. If he wanted to stay and others around him were pressuring him to go, that would be unfortunate. I don't believe that's the case here at all. So I think you have to make the decision that's right for you. There is the risk of injury, and for a player who's a marginal prospect, the injury sets you back even more than it would for, say, someone like if Stanley Johnson a couple of years ago at Arizona had decided to stay for another year and had been injured, he would have lost something significant. And he's a guy that might have stayed and chose not to. Those problems, for a guy who has a great prospect and maybe goes from 7th in the draft, which he became, to 20th because he got injured. Jared Sullinger's another. Probably was a low teens, low double figures pick after his freshman year, wound up 20th because he got hurt. I mean, there's a risk in that. But if you're a marginal prospect and you get hurt, and then you have to devote time to rehab and all that sort of stuff, and you're not healthy or fit when you go into the league, or you go into professional basketball, I guess I should say, then you really get set back. So I think you're 100% on with that, Alex. You have to make the decision that's best for you. And I'm not saying that no one ever makes the wrong decision. I really believe Isaiah Briscoe, if he'd gone back to Kentucky and shot, and got his shot up to where he was shooting in the 35 to 40% range from 3-point, I think he could have become a first-round pick. I do believe he'll be undervalued in this draft because I think that he's a much better athlete than people realize, and a much better basketball player than people realize, because they look at the surface and don't look at little things all the time. And I think he's a guy who maybe would have benefited from playing another year. But in James's case, in OG's case, in Thomas's case, I think, I can understand why they're ready to move on.
In terms of OG, I think we've all known for a long time that he was going to be gone. But the other one that was kind of up in the air, or at least there was some curiosity as to what the decision would be, is Thomas Bryant. And now we know that he's staying in the draft, going to hire an agent. Overall, I guess, what do you think of what do you make of his time in Bloomington? It seemed to me like he maybe regressed a little bit as a sophomore. Just maybe not regressed is the right word. Maybe fell short of expectations based on kind of where he was pegged in the preseason. And what kind of future do you think he has at the next level? A lot of people questioning whether or not his athleticism is going to be good enough to play in the paint and finish against bigger guys in the NBA. But he's also shown that he can step out and shoot the ball. So and he's still young at 19. So I'm just curious, kind of, how you kind of step back and look at his Indiana career as a whole, and also what you think of his prospects at the next level.
I think his perimeter skill, and not just in shooting, which is significant, but also his ability to move with the ball. I mean, look, he's not driving by anybody and dunking in the NBA very often. I mean, it's not going to happen. But he can put the ball on the floor and move it to other spots, and that ability as a big man is not it's not something that's prevalent. And so he can get by and maybe make the defense react and then make a pass, and that leads to a bucket. So those things are valuable. He does have to become much stronger and tougher. And I think that will happen in time if he wants it. I think Thomas is a case, honestly, I believe, that he has to show how much he wants to play, as much as any player in this draft that has talent. One thing that's underrated as we look at these guys, and it's hard, and part of the reason it's underrated is because it's not always easy to tell who's really going to want it. I mean, the perfect example of this is LeBron James, okay? I'm not comparing Thomas to LeBron James, but the point I want to make about LeBron is he's almost a billionaire now. I mean, I don't know his exact net worth, but he's up there. And yet he still plays 44 minutes a night in the playoffs, and he still wants to win that next championship as much as he wanted to win the first. I mean, that level of competitiveness is not common. And I'll go to an opposite end. Sean Kilpatrick of Cincinnati left Cincinnati as a first-team All-American. Wasn't somebody that the draft welcomed after playing a year of prep school and then redshirting, and then 4 years at Cincinnati. He was fairly old by prospect standards. So he wasn't somebody that draft people were excited about. He didn't shoot great numbers in college because he was the only offensive player on his team, so he had to take a lot of bad shots. But he got to the pro game, and he could have said to himself, I can make $400,000 a year in Germany or France or Italy or wherever. I can be pretty happy with that. I can play 10 years, retire with a couple mil in the bank, have a nice life. But he wouldn't accept not being a professional, not being an NBA player. He wouldn't accept it. He drove himself to the point where he was an NBA player, and now he's in the league. And if Thomas does that, Thomas is going to be a fine NBA player, a very good one, because he can shoot it, he can handle it. He's got decent post skills inside if he has the strength to complement them. So he can be that, but he's not going to make it just on his talent. I mean, he's got to really want this to take the next step. There are a lot of really tall, skilled guys who've entered the NBA and just decided, tried to hang on, tried to hide, tried to make a few rosters, put some money in the bank, but they didn't want it badly enough. And I think there's a question there. How badly is he going to want this, based on the fact that he didn't always battle at the college level? How badly is he going to want this? Because I think he's going to be one of those players that's going to have to really show year after year that this really means something to him.
So as we look at the roster now, obviously OG's leaving, Thomas is leaving, James is leaving, 3 players leaving off of a team that only won 18 games last year, and I think the impact of that is going to be the general expectations for Indiana coming into next season are going to be lowered, with no 5-star recruit replacements coming in. And we're obviously still waiting to hear what Robert Johnson is going to do. And I should say, expectations will be lowered everywhere, I think, but inside the Indiana locker room, if we've learned anything about Archie Miller. So what are your expectations now, as you look at what's left for Indiana, again, with Robert Johnson's decision still pending? What are your expectations for Indiana and Archie Miller's first year?
I think my expectation is that they build a culture. They build the Archie Miller culture, which isn't to say that the Tom Crean culture wasn't functional or whatever. I don't think it's unfair to say it wasn't quite all the way to where it could have been. I mean, otherwise you don't miss the tournament a year after you win the championship. So I understand there were injuries and that sort of thing, but it still wasn't quite to the point where it needed to be for Indiana basketball to be annually competitive at the top of the Big Ten, to be annually competitive nationally. I think that's the reputation, and that's what the first year of Indiana basketball under Archie Miller has to be about. Results are important, and if he's successful in redefining the way Indiana plays and what Indiana expects inside the locker room and inside the practice court, if he's successful at that, I think their record will be better than maybe preseason projections suggest. But it's mostly about defending better, playing together more tightly, being more of a collective force than they were a year ago. I think those things are important to them as they go forward. And they've got guys who, even though they haven't been overly accomplished to this point, they've got guys who can fit into that. I mean, Juwan Morgan's a perfect example. Tom did a great job of finding Juwan Morgan, but then this past year, I thought Juwan, you talked about regressed. I thought Juwan regressed. When his minutes went up, he was not the defender that he'd been the year before, because the year before he'd only played limited possessions. He was an energy guy. He came out, he changed the game with his energy and his athleticism, but then asked to defend position after possession against really good offensive basketball players. He struggled sometimes with his attention to detail. That's got to change, and that's what Archie Miller will be enforcing in his first year. I mean, Juwan Morgan should go out this year in the Big Ten and be as good a defender as there is in the league. As you know, be competitive for Defensive Player of the Year honors. That's what he should be this year. If Arch is successful, that's what he will be. Deron Davis, I mentioned before, I really think he can score significantly in this league. Robert Johnson's return is important, because to have a backcourt player who can play all three positions, that would really be helpful. And a guy who could probably average, given the responsibility that he would have as a veteran player, who could probably average 14, 15 points a game. So those guys can all build a nice foundation. It's not a roster that you would put in the same conversation with what Michigan State's going to put on the floor this next season. But it's not a roster that they have to be fearful that they're going to get overwhelmed like maybe they did in Tom's first couple of years.
When you look at the differences between Archie Miller's program that he's going to have in Indiana and what Tom Crean had in Indiana, what do you think, just from a casual observer, somebody that maybe doesn't study it as closely as we do, what are they going to see as the main differences between Archie and Tom?
Well, I think Archie has a big advantage over Tom in that, what I just talked about. They have guys who've played and been good players, not great players. The great players, the guys who were really significant, have all departed for the NBA. But they've got good players, guys who've been, that have been on the floor in Big Ten games and made plays that you said, hey, that was not bad. That was pretty good. Deron and Curtis Jones and Devontae Green have all had moments. Josh Newkirk down the stretch had some really good moments. Wasn't consistent through the year, but did some good things, the Penn State game being the great example. So Archie has a big advantage over Tom in that regard. So from a standpoint of building a foundation, he's got something to build on, and Tom left him with that. The difference I think that you'll see with Arch is I do think that they'll defend more consistently at a high level. I think if you go through Ken Palm's rankings over the last 5 or 6 years, however long it's been since Indiana really started feeling real Big Ten teams again in 2011-12, as good as they were at times, Sweet 16 that year, Sweet 16 the next year, winning the league, Sweet 16 last season, not this past season, but 2016, and winning the league as well. They rarely were elite defensively, and I think that Arch's Indiana teams will be, they'll be in Ken Palm. You'll see them in the top 20 more often than we did under Tom in defense. And so I think that'll be the biggest difference. Offensively, what Arch has to show, and he's still got this part of his game to prove, is he's shown that he can grind out baskets with good Atlantic 10 players, and do it not only in the Atlantic 10, but also against higher levels of competition, more talented teams than he was fielding once they got into the NCAAs and occasionally in non-league. What he's got to do now is he's got to show that he can put high-level offensive teams on the floor, with great offensive talent, the kinds of guys that they're going to want to sign over the next 2, 3, 4 years, and show that he can get those guys to guard and show that he can build offenses around them. I mean, he hasn't had that luxury yet. And he's had, like I said, really good Atlantic 10 players, but never a superstar, All-America level Atlantic 10 player like you see from time to time in the American or the Mountain West. No Kawhi Leonard, for instance. He never had that guy. He had really good, sound teams. Well, he's going to want to have that guy at Indiana. That's Romeo Langford, if he's able to get him, for example. I mean, you're going to have to build an offense around a guy like that, and that's something that he hasn't had to do. When Tom got here, he'd done that. He'd done it with Dwayne Wade, for instance, and he built that trio offense that he had when he had Wes Matthews and Jarrell McNeil, etc. So those guys, he had a little bit of an advantage in that regard. But I think that you build consistent winners at this level by starting with a culture that values the defensive end and then teaches great offensive players to play that sort of defense. That's what Tom Izzo has done consistently at Michigan State. That's what ultimately Bo Ryan did in his final years at Wisconsin. And that's what Arch is going to want to shoot for as he builds. And this is what his brother's done, obviously, at Arizona. I mean, there's no better example of that than what Sean did this past year at Arizona when he took guys like Raleigh Alkins, who a lot of scouts said doesn't want to do anything but shoot, or Kobe Simmons, who I will tell you with my own two eyes, I watched him play 3 AAU games and just saw no intensity at all from him. And he played really hard for Sean. And so Arch has a great role model in that regard in his brother. I think I'm convinced he'll do those things, but he hasn't yet done those things. He hasn't yet had the opportunity.
How big of a challenge is it for a coach when they take over a program? Because these are all guys that Archie's going to have that he didn't recruit. They're not guys that he necessarily would have recruited, but now these are now his guys. I mean, he said that in his opening press conference. I didn't recruit you, but now you're my players. How hard is it for him? How hard or difficult of a challenge is it going to be for him to put his stamp to get these guys to buy in to what he wants to do when they were maybe recruited to play in a different system?
I think that the first thing you do is you go to guys and say, here's how we can make you better. Here's how you can, you go to a Josh Newkirk, who, if you look at him, I mean, he should be a great defender. I mean, there's no excuse for him not being a great defender. He is tough. He is strong. He is quick on his feet. And then he didn't have a good defensive season. I mean, so you go to Josh Newkirk and you say, we're going to make you into a game changer. That's where you're going to be. You're going to matter, and people are going to get excited about it, and we're going to sell it. And you go to Juwan Morgan and you say something similar. Right? You show him the tape of the Butler game and show him messing up the screens over and over, and you say, you're not going to do that for us. We're going to get you in the right spots. You're going to read those screens properly. And people are going to be excited about you, and we're going to win games. And you're going to be someone that the NBA gets thrilled about, and we'll work on your shot so that you can be one of those guys that the NBA calls a 3-and-D guy. I mean, Juwan Morgan's not ever going to be someone that is likely to put the ball on the floor and go past people time after time or break them down off the dribble. It's just not the player he's evolved to be at this stage, and it's hard to make up for 8 years, 10 years of development in however many years you spend in college. So you are this. I mean, Kawhi Leonard was that in college. I mean, he was a better version, but that's who he was. He was a tough, strong kid who could shoot it a little and who could really rebound and really score, and who could guard the heck out of you. Well, I mean, he's made the league on that. Danny Green at Carolina was a great shooter and a good athlete, and they've made him into a guy who can be in the league because he can make shots and defend his position. So you go to Juwan and you say, well, in order to do those two things, one, you have to work on your shot, and two, you have to defend your position. I mean, he didn't do that the way he should have a year ago. So Keelan Martin against him in the Butler game, go watch the tape. I mean, that Juwan Morgan's got to be better than that, and I think that's how you get those guys on board. You tell them how you're going to make them better, not just for Indiana and for Archie Miller, but for Jawan Morgan and Josh Newkirk and the basketball they want to play beyond Indiana.
Mike, looking at the Big Ten as a whole, obviously the conference got some great news when Miles Bridges decided to stay, and we're still awaiting word on, again, guys like Robert Johnson and Caleb Swanigan. But as you look at it right now, how does the top of the Big Ten, how is it starting to shake out, and where do you see Indiana kind of falling in there right now as you project things forward?
Well, I think you start with Michigan State because they have the ingredients to be a national championship team, especially now with the good news that they got Monday with Ben Carter returning. They now have great depth on the interior. Miles Bridges returning gives them an All-America level talent. Cassius Winston should be a better player as a sophomore. Josh Langford should be a better player as a sophomore. I'll be surprised if Nick Ward doesn't show up in much better shape as a sophomore, and therefore able to play more minutes and play more effectively. And he'll probably only have to play 25 or so because of the depth they have. But those will be 25 really good minutes. So I think that they have a chance to be, a national championship contender. Everybody in the league will chase them to a degree, but it won't be easy for them. Northwestern will get back Aaron Falzone and return most of the team that advanced in the NCAA tournament. Purdue, Swanigan obviously would make an enormous difference, but they're going to be very good with or without. Because Isaac Haas will move into the starting lineup and play more, and they've still got very good players around him. It's still somewhat it's a slightly flawed team. The slight flaw is what prevents them from being, a likely national championship contender. They just don't have enough athletic juice on the perimeter to change games. I mean, they can get the ball to the rim, but with small guys. They don't have that one wing guy, and maybe it's in their recruiting class. I haven't seen their prospects, but they don't have that one wing guy that can break you down and a guy like a guy who can really make a difference. Obviously the best example of that would be Justin Jackson, who really who did it for Carolina this year. They don't have somebody in that mold, or a Theo Pinson even, who can make a play off the bounce in the way that you really need it to be a championship team. But Purdue's going to be a team that gets to the tournament and goes far. Minnesota, again. So I think the league shapes up really well. Minnesota returns most of the team that earned a 5 seed. I mean, they didn't spend it very well, but they got a really tough draw against Middle Tennessee. So I think those teams all have great potential, and the next wave, Michigan should be excellent as a sort of a middle pack team, somewhere in the 4 to 7 range that I think will again make it back to the tournament. Iowa was very young last year. Penn State was very young. I think the league looks very promising, and Maryland as well, another team that was very young. We'll miss Melo Trimble a lot, but had 3 freshmen starting for a lot of the year that added a lot to them. And so it looks to me like a really promising league, and Indiana's going to have to fight very hard to stay in the top half. And if you're in the top half, you're probably going to be at least a contender for a tournament bid. I mean, this is a year that you look at the Big Ten and you say, they can get somewhere between 7 and 9 bids.
So you think an NCAA tournament bid fair to expect for Indiana, even in Archie Miller's first season?
I think contention for one. Yeah. I don't know that you'd expect that they'd get one, but I think it's fair to expect that they'd be in contention. I mean, a year ago, Illinois was in contention down to the final day, played at Rutgers and couldn't win the game, and so they were out. But they were in contention. Now the problem with that was, John was at the end of his cycle. I mean, so they needed to make it. And they probably needed to make it more easily. I mean, if they had made it under those circumstances, they might still have made a change. Illinois was at the point in their, like I said, evolution where you should have been a strong, firm NCAA tournament team, not a team that had to go win a road game on the final day to stay alive. So if Indiana had a similar season in results to what Illinois had a year ago, I think that would be a success, as long as the form of it was all the things I talked about, better defense, a bit more, togetherness on the floor, and then I think you're going to have a positive atmosphere around the team that will maybe help, deliver results that could be the difference between, being on the road at Rutgers on the final day and losing and not making it, or, being in more solid position than that and, squeezing into a 10 or 8 or 9 seed or something like that. I mean, if they could pull off something like that in their first year, I think they would consider that to be a rousing success.
Once again, follow him on Twitter at TSN Mike. Read his work at the Sporting News and on the Big Ten Network. Mike, we always appreciate your insight on the Hoosiers. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Alex, Jerod, it's always a pleasure doing this, and I enjoyed listening to it very much, and continued good luck with it.
All right, thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We'll be back next week with another brand new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.